In this final segment on macroevolution, we're going to talk about the hows, not the evidence for, but how can we get new species forming. So we talked a little bit about that when we talked about artificial selection, but this in general is what happens in nature. So one of the most common ways you can get new species is through one of several types of reproductive isolating mechanisms. That means when you get a population and you separate it into one or more or two or more populations, and these individuals within these populations are isolated from each other reproductively, meaning they either can't get together, or even if you bring them together, they don't recognize each other as the same species, they don't want to mate with each other, or they physically can't mate with each other, or even if you get them mating, something's going on at the molecular level that keeps them from forming fertile offspring, usually something that's happening with the chromosomes. So we can break these reproductive isolating mechanisms into two types, prezygotic and postzygotic. So zygo means zygote, like a fertilized egg. So prezygotic means that there are differences among individuals from these two populations that keep them from recognizing each other as the same species. So whether they could physically mate or not, they don't want to. They either don't recognize each other or they just don't want to, and that thus it keeps them isolated before a zygote ever gets created, and hence prezygotic. So for example, check out these cute, cuddly little albatrosses. Like so many birds, they have a very regimented courtship display. So for the albatrosses, you know, they kind of like kiss each other and they go ding and they go ding and they have this, it's almost a dance. And it turns out that that dance is ingrained into their DNA. They're genetically prone to do a certain specific courtship display. And if any part of that courtship display is missing or messed up, or there's something added to it, they may not recognize this potential mate. So any changes in the DNA or the expression of the genes that lead to these courtship dances, that can actually be a prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism in keeping these guys from reproducing with each other. For example, again, if they can't recognize the display, they can't reproduce. And then there's postzygotic. So postzygotic mechanisms are where, okay, they recognized each other, they went ahead and mated, you know, they did the hokey pokey, but then something's going on at the molecular level that keeps them from producing fertile or viable offspring. So something that happens after fertilization. And usually this has to do with differences in number of chromosomes that keep viable, meaning fertile, hybrids from forming. So this happens all the time, for example, in fish, like the Pacific salmon, near and dear to my heart. If you look at their chromosome numbers, even though they're oftentimes in the same genus, you know, they have drastically different chromosome diploid numbers, you know, among different species, you know, ranging from sockeye to chinook to coho salmon, you know, different tastiness as well. And so one of the ways you can study this is you can create karyotypes. This is a field called cytology. And you can see here where you can actually tag certain genes in the chromosomes, but you can line them up and figure out, you know, where have these genes jump to, how many chromosomes does the organism have. So that's a postzygotic mechanism because it happens after fertilization that keeps these fertile hybrids from forming. This is very common, for example, in plants. So plants often have polyploidy, where they completely duplicated the number of chromosomes in each cell, their diploid number. So for example like wheat is hexaploidy. They actually have 6 copies of each type of chromosome from the ancestor. So whole genome duplication happens all the time in plants, a lot of times in fish, and a lot of times in insects. Another reproductive isolating mechanism is called geographic isolation. So geographic isolation is when a population gets separated by some geographic barrier. Let's take an example with the Isthmus of Panama. So Isthmus of Panama formed some time ago, you know, we're talking many, many thousands of years ago. And it's just this little geographic barrier here that formed between North and South America. Well, prior to that, there was a species of fish, a wrasse, that was able to travel easily between the Atlantic and the Pacific sides. Once this isthmus formed, that population got bisected into two subpopulations, one on the Atlantic side and one on the Pacific side. Ta-da-da, setting up the opportunity for natural selection, because it turns out that these oceans are different. The Pacific side is 2 to 3 degrees lower than the Atlantic side. And thus, the fish that live on the Pacific side need to develop enzymes that will allow them to live in a colder temperature. And so if you look at the enzymes and the amino acid sequence between the blue-headed wrasse and the Cortez rainbow wrasse, one lives on one side of the isthmus, one on the other. If you study their amino acid sequences, you'll see they only differ by a very few number of amino acids out of the total number that make up these enzymes that allow them to tolerate temperature. So the Cortez rainbow fish, rainbow wrasse, is on the Pacific side, which is colder. And so he has enzymes that function at slightly lower temperatures than the blue-headed wrasse on the warmer Atlantic side. And you may remember enzymes are highly affected by temperature. And so if they're not a specific kind of enzyme for a specific kind of temperature, the enzyme doesn't get expressed and that fish wouldn't be able to survive. So that's an example of geographic isolation. Sometimes you can get new species produced within the same geographic area, even when they have a hybrid zone. So let's take over here the Bullock's Oriole and the Baltimore Oriole, yes, like the baseball team. So originally they had a hybrid zone located in the central United States. And so over time, these guys actually stopped hybridizing. So their hybrid zone was shrinking and shrinking until it basically became non-existent. And at that point, we consider these guys separate species. Sympatric speciation is speciation that happens within the same geographic area. And a special case of that is Peripatric speciation, which is what happened with the Bullocks and the Baltimore Oriole, where they had a hybrid zone, but because it was shrinking over time, they eventually stopped reproducing and became separate species. So if you look at the Bullock's Oriole and the Baltimore Oriole, they have different colorations. Even though they're similar, the pattern is different. And so if we look at their original geographic ranges, the Baltimore Oriole was here kind of on the east side through the Midwest, and the Bullock's Oriole was on the west side through the Midwest. And right here in the middle of the Midwest, they had a hybrid zone. But over time, due to evolutionary changes, probably in their courtship displays, that hybrid zone shrank and shrank and shrank. So they started to not recognize each other as the same species. They preferred to mate with individuals looking more similar to themselves than to the other guy. And so, bird watchers are out here every year taking copious notes on the number of each individual kind that we see. And so over a 20-year time span, that hybrid zone shrank so much that by 1997, the American Ornithologists Union decided these guys are no longer subspecies of each other. They have enough genetic differences to warrant being called separate species. And so now the Bullocks and the Baltimore are considered separate species, whereas prior to that, they were not. But that's an example of sympatric speciation and peripatric speciation leading to separate species. So it's a reproductive isolating mechanism. Finally, let's talk about allopatric speciation. So this is speciation that happens away from the original area where the species were located. So allo tends to mean like opposite, for example. So this is often seen on islands. Allopatric speciation, new species arise when populations are geographically isolated from each other. And a good example of this is with this adorable guy, the Hawaiian honey creeper. If you look at the different islands in the Hawaiian archipelago, you will see all these different honey creepers that look quite different from each other, have different beaks, etc., and different behavioral patterns. So for example, the liwi is a nectar feeder, whereas, this little guy here eats small prey. This one up here eats fruit and seeds. And so what happened is these guys, their original ancestor originated on the mainland of the United States. He gets to, actually probably a she, gets to one island about 4,000 kilometers away, faces a whole new set of predators, whole new set of niches, and thus natural selection acts on that and selects for individuals that can fulfill different niches because of the different beaks. And then some of those individuals end up colonizing a second island, ta-da, whole new set of niches, new foods, new predators, new environment. And so you get a diversification again after that. From there, some individuals colonize yet another island and diversify further, etc. So you're basically getting a whole lot of species events, new species arising due to some of those evolutionary mechanisms we talked about: natural selection, genetic drift, including the founder effect and the bottleneck, and geographic isolation, reproductive isolation. So island change, you tend to get speciation happening very fast because new sets of niches to be filled by new species. And just a side note here, I'll stick myself over here. Endemic species are species that are found in one place and found nowhere else in the world. And so this, in island change, you tend to have a lot of endemic species. So for example, Hawaii, it only makes up 2% of the world's land mass, but it has 40% of the world's fruit flies living right there in it. And having lived in Hawaii, trust me, there's a lot of fruit flies there. So anyway, allopatric speciation, another mechanism by which you can get macroevolutionary changes, new species arising over time.